Hey, I'll see you on tour in Las Vegas, Chicago, and Grand Rapids. In Chicago, it's stand-up and a live panel show. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets, and make sure you go to jimmydore.com. Glenn Greenwald did a great breakdown of the good and the bad with J.D. Vance, Trump's vice president pick. And so let's go through some of it.
I've always believed that Donald Trump was always teetering between two contradictory impulses. On the one hand, you have the Donald Trump of 2016, who aggressively and purely ran his campaign on a vow not just to subvert and overturn the dogma of the Democratic establishment, but also the Republican Party's establishment in both economic policy and foreign policy, and in general of how those parties operate. And all the populist promises that were made about no more wars, needless wars that have nothing to do with the United States, promising to save Medicare and Social Security, making corporations pay higher taxes, especially these big corporate conglomerates who are shipping jobs overseas. But then you have the Donald Trump whose presidency was filled with traditional Republican operatives who were extremely pro-establishment in their terms of ideology, including Mike Pence, his vice presidential choice in 20.
You know, the joke I used to do was like Donald Trump said he was going to get rid of the swamp, and he was going to drain the swamp, and he did. And what did he find at the bottom? His cabinet. He put the worst guys from the swamp in his cabinet. John Bolton, Mike Pompeo.
His State Department Secretary of State and CIA Director, Mike Pompeo, his ambassador to the UN, who is Nikki Haley, his foreign policy advisor, who is John Bolton, and so many more. And oftentimes the Trump administration veered in one direction, oftentimes it veered in the other. And of course, the question that should be on most people's minds, especially as Trump looks increasingly likely to be elected if he's not killed between now and the election, is in what direction ideologically does Donald Trump intend to go with the new administration that he's likely to inaugurate on the 20th of January in the year to come? And I always thought that the vice presidential choice was going to be illustrative, or suggestive at least, of that direction. Not dispositive, but definitely important for understanding Trump's current mindset in that regard. And I was very concerned about a lot of the names that were clearly at the top of Trump's list, such as Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, or Tim Scott, the Republican senator from South Carolina. All of these people who have been around Washington who don't have a heterodox or anti-establishment bone in their body.
So that's the two impulses of Donald Trump, right? He ran on doing the exact opposite of what it seemed like he did. He said he's going to get rid of the swamp. He put him right in his cabinet. Okay, so that's the two impulses he has. He does have them, right? Because he is a billionaire. He is an establishment guy, but he's also anti-establishment in some ways. So let's keep going.
The person on the list that I thought would be the best, both from Trump's electoral perspective, but also in terms of suggesting that that was going to go in the right direction, was J.D. Vance. And that's exactly who Donald Trump chose today. And by that, I don't mean that J.D. Vance is, and by any means, a perfect politician. There are a lot of views he holds that I vehemently oppose, although most of those are views that anyone in mainstream Washington life and mainstream U.S. politics holds and almost has to hold in order to have any kind of career at the top of Washington power. But there are a lot of views J.D. Vance holds that I find genuinely wrong, misguided, or even destructive. But there is no question, not based on his rhetoric, but based on his actions in the Senate, that he believes far more in this populist, anti-establishment sentiment and ideology that Donald Trump ran on in 2016 than any of the other viable alternatives, and certainly more than, say, someone like Kamala Harris, who also doesn't have a populist or anti-establishment bone in her body. Now, I know there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party, and even on the better part of the left that hates the Democratic Party, that just cannot conceive that anybody with an R after their name could possibly have any authentic desire to pursue policies that help the working class. Even leftists who hate the Democratic Party, I think, sometimes assume that the only possibility for being authentic in that desire to help the working class is if you have a D after your name. Which isn't to say that the left thinks every Democrat is a working class champion, but that's the only possible way someone might be. Like an AOC or Bernie Sanders, people who still buy into their shtick. So, for the moment, don't listen to anything I have to say. Don't listen to anything J.D. Vance has to say. Listen to the president of the Teamsters Union, Sean O'Brien, who went on Fox News today to be interviewed about the choice of J.D. Vance and the reason why the Teamsters regards him in so many ways as an important ally to the working class. And it wasn't just his rhetoric, the Teamsters president's rhetoric, it was the specific acts that J.D. Vance has undertaken as a senator that he believes evince a authentic concern for the American working class.
I mean, J.D. Vance, the short time that we've worked together, I mean, he's been great on Teamster issues. He has supported, co-sponsored an airline manufacturing bill that addresses outsourcing of critical airline maintenance to China. He's also supported paid sick leave for our railroad workers. If you remember that situation a couple of years ago, when they weren't getting sick time, he stepped right up. He's also been very vocal and supportive of holding employers accountable who try and skirt their obligation under an independent contractor model known as TSP. So he's been right there on all our issues. We publicly stated it. And look, at this day and age, there's nothing better than having a U.S. Marine represented as a vice president candidate.
No, I've seen a lot of Democratic pundits instantly say, oh, this is a terrible pick for Trump. He only appeals to the MAGA base. He's not going to expand Trump's appeal. they all start claiming, oh, thank God he didn't choose Marco Rubio, who would have been a much better choice for Trump. Obviously, if Trump had chosen Rubio, they'd be saying exactly the opposite, but let them convince themselves of that a very smart, highly accomplished 39-year-old Marine who grew up to some extent, certainly, with a working class and blue-collar background and who has a record sufficient to make the Teamsters Union president gush about his commitment to the working class, let them try and convince themselves that that's some politically poor choice.
I didn't know anything. I don't know much about JD Vance, but now we're finding out. And so I from my initial glance, it looks like a mixed bag, but there are some positives, just like Glenn pointed out, and the Teamsters president pointed out. So as Joe Biden was crushing a railroad union strike, he was standing up for them. That's something.
And open for Trump to end the funding of the war in Ukraine.
So he also voted against the war in Ukraine. So that's a big deal. So he's against that. That's unbelievable. Is there one Democrat that's against that?
And open for Trump to end the funding of the war in Ukraine. A exchange that JD Vance had when he talked to Tucker Carlson earlier this year. Tucker Carlson has become a big fan of JD Vance's. And this exchange, I think, gives a lot of insight as well into what JD Vance thinks about Washington politics, establishment ideology.
And just so everybody knows, I know some people are, because of my shows on Rumble, that some people think I'm not. I guess there's a connection between JD Vance and Peter Thiel. And they're like, oh, well, now because you're on Rumble, you're not going to criticize JD Vance like that. This is silly to say that. I've already criticized him for his allegiance to Israel. And we're going to get to know him. He's going to be the vice president for 4 years. So I'm sure there's going to be lots of times we're going to be critical of him. And he'll probably go on to be president for at least 4 years. So we're going to get 8 years to be critical of him. And we're going to be. Okay.
And the Uniparty's view of war and economic policy. I thought this exchange was very telling.
On. So the most striking thing about that exchange you had was the number that you put, the price tag that you threw out there. Can you just slowly explain what you think this war will cost the United States all in?
Yeah, so of course, Tucker, it's impossible to say because every single day this goes on, we spend more money, not just the money that's obvious and meets the headlines, but also the stuff that we're putting ourselves all in for rebuilding costs and so forth. So let me just give you a sense of what I mean here. The headline number of what we spent on Ukraine is $120 billion. The Biden administration is asking for another $61 billion. And a lot of Senate, even Republicans, seem hell-bent on giving him that money. That's $180 billion just right there. Now, what that doesn't include is if this thing goes on for a year or two beyond that, it also doesn't include what's called presidential drawdown authority, where let's say Joe Biden gives weapons that were manufactured in the United States or somewhere else, gives them to Zelensky. They can use weird accounting gimmicks to understate how many resources have actually been given. So if we've given $120 billion at a headline number thus far, it's probably closer to $150 or even $160 billion. That is partially a guess, but it's an informed guess. The other thing, Tucker, is that we've already told people in no uncertain terms that we're going to rebuild this country. You hear things like a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, whether it's implemented by BlackRock or overseen by BlackRock. We're talking about an additional $200, $300, maybe $400 billion to rebuild this country. Already, Tucker, the Ukrainians are unable to pay their pensioners. There are critical parts of the Ukrainian state. You know, things like fixing the roads, ambulance services, pension provisions that the Ukrainians can't provide for themselves at this point. So when you take this all in, Tucker, I really think that even if the war ended, let's say 6 months from now, the all-in cost of the American taxpayer is going to be about $500 billion. Again, that is a guess, but it's an informed guess based on what we've already spent and what we might be expected to spend in the future. It's a catastrophic sum of money when you think about, Tucker, what it's accomplished, which is that we've basically turned Ukraine into a rump state. And this can't be overstated. The goal here was always to turn Ukraine into an independent ally that could stand against the Russians. Now, set to the side whether this is a goal worth spending $500 billion for. I don't think that it is. But even if you assume that goal as the policy of the United States of America, we have not accomplished anything close to it. The country has gone from about 40 million people to 28 million people. A ton of prime age men. I mean, men in the prime of their lives here have been killed or wounded or maimed. They'll never be functional people ever again. And that is what we've accomplished here. It has become a rump state that will become a permanent welfare client of the United States of America and of NATO. But I joke almost when I say that NATO is going to pick up the tab here because we all know they won't.
All right, now, again, you can find quotes of his saying Putin's invasion was outrageous and immoral, something every American politician says, essentially, even that it's morally justified to send them defensive weapons. But not only his most frequent explanations that you saw there, but also his vote, the thing that matters even more, makes clear that he opposes ongoing endless funding by the United States. And he always says, which is a good political answer, but it's also true that, look, if people in the West want to fund this war, it should be funded by those countries, the very rich countries in Western Europe closest to that war, and not by us. And one of the things I think is so notable is in his rationale, and he often does this, he speaks about the evils of centralized corporate power and global capital institutions like BlackRock and JP Morgan. He is very well aware that once we end up destroying Ukraine with all the weapons we're sending, we'll pay BlackRock and JP Morgan and all of those vultures waiting to come in and rebuild Ukraine at a great profit to themselves and at the expense of the American taxpayer. And I think this is one of the most important things, is that when he sits down for a debate with Kamala Harris, and this is not true of any of the other potential choices Trump had that he was actively considering. Again, I'm not talking here about Vivek Ramaswamy or Tulsi Gabbard. I don't consider them, and haven't considered them, actual viable choices of Trump's for a long time. It was clear they got eliminated early in the process. They were ever in it. Talking about the reported choices Trump was actively considering in the last several weeks, what J.D. Vance was able to do in a debate with Kamala Harris, credibly, is he's not going to use this standard Reagan-esque Republican rhetoric about how Kamala Harris is some fanatic of redistribution, financial policies because she wants to take from the rich and fund the poor. He's not going to accuse her of that. In part because those things are popular, but also because that's not what she is. He'll be able to accuse her, and I think of the vice presidential candidates Trump could have chosen, only he will be able to accuse her credibly of being what she actually is, which is an instrument of corporatism and the large centralized global corporations that fund the Democratic Party, that have funded her career, and that the Democratic Party typically serves. And you have a long record from J.D. Vance of this kind of language that posits that you have global institutions of capital on the one hand, and on the other you have the working class, and that the working class is typically the victims of this large centralized corporate power. And there's lots of other things beyond what the Teamster Union's president identified as instances in which J.D. Vance has not only spoken that talk, but actually pursued it.
So that is a major league positive on his side. That is a major league positive. Okay. All right. So let's keep going.
Now, this is a speech that I saw only today, and I just want to show you one clip of it. It was when he gave an address at the Quincy Institute in May of 2024. It was only about a 20-minute speech. You can find this speech on YouTube if you want to understand J.D. Vance's thinking. I really encourage you to go watch this. It is a well-thought-through speech intended to express his ideology about the Republican establishment, the Democratic establishment. But here's one passage that I found very telling and very interesting.
Senator Mitch McConnell was elected literally the year that I was born. And Mitch McConnell is extremely confident about nearly every single foreign policy view that he holds, despite the fact that he's been a senator since I was born, and nearly every foreign policy position he's held has actually been wrong. Okay. So whatever your views, if I can impart something really, really important to you or anybody else who's listening on social media or otherwise, it's that we have to be open to new arguments. When people say something that challenges our preconceived notions, if your response is to sort of think about it, that's good. Whatever conclusion you ultimately come to. If your response is to kind of seize up and immediately repeat the slogans that we've all heard for the last 40 years, you are part of the problem. And we have to beat back the problem if we're going to fix what's going on in the country. So let me sort of articulate two, and this is not meant to be a full-scale or fulsome explanation of my foreign policy, but there are two principles that I really care about, and I think are really important because they bear on this question of the middle class. The first is that the first is like a weird feedback there, but the first is that we have to really understand that I think most of us are realists, right? In other words, we think that our foreign policy should pursue America's interests and pursue it ruthlessly. But that doesn't mean, even though we can criticize the moralisms of the past, that we can have a foreign policy that's totally divorced from morality. What I would say is we should have a foreign policy that recognizes that the moral intuitions that should most matter are the moral intuitions of American citizens. Okay. That's principle number one. I'll talk about that in a second. Principle number two is that the most important part of American, got it? Thank you. Principle number two is that the most important part of American foreign policy is actually the strength of our domestic economy and the strength of our domestic population. And if there is something that should worry all of us, I think it's not that China is showing more belligerence in East Asia, that certainly should worry us. It's not that China is sort of expanding its scope into South America and to Africa as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, though again, I do think that should worry us. It's that China, based and because of the stupidity of Washington leaders over the past generation, is now arguably the most powerful industrial economy in the world. Okay, if we're going to lose a war, it will be because we have allowed our primary rival to become arguably our most powerful industrial competitor. And God forbid, I worry that in 10 years, it will become obvious that China is not our primary industrial competitor, but that we're theirs, that they are now the preeminent industrial power in the world. And if we get there, yes, it will be because all of these bad things about China, and we can criticize China. But if we get there, the primary reason will be because our leaders led us down a very stupid path to very predictable consequences. I'm angry about the rise of China. And certainly I don't think that the Chinese are our friends, but I'm most angry that American leadership led.
All right, just cut off there in the middle, but he's basically saying, and again, I don't want to overstate the case when it comes to his heterodox foreign policy views. This kind of talk about China is very standard in Washington. But he's not advocating a war with China, either a Cold War or a hot war. He's recognizing the fact that China is, in fact, as strong as, or maybe soon to become stronger than the United States economically. And that's in large part because of the mistakes that the political class has made. And he begins by being pretty scathing about Mitch McConnell's worldview and the way in which the bipartisan class, not just the Democratic Party, have pursued all these wars that have not been in American interests. And so I think the fact that this is the kind of thing that J.D. Vance is going around saying should give some further encouragement about which side of that divide he is on, the anti-establishment populist divide or the Republican establishment. Not to any pure or great extent, you can find lots of examples of J.D. Vance reciting standard Washington policy, especially when it comes to foreign policy. He made a lot of his money in the kind of global capital hedge funds and venture capital funds of the kind that he rails against, which oftentimes happens. People enter a certain sector, see the evils of it, and become its enemies. And there's certainly a lot of evidence that he actually does think that way, but he's not some revolutionary who's going to come in and overturn all of Washington. So I don't want to exaggerate that at all.
Okay, that's coming from a Republican. I mean, let's keep going.
Here, Fox News in October of 2023 reported this: Republican senators introduced a standalone bill to aid Israel without more funding to Ukraine. Quote, Republican lawmakers oppose combining Ukraine and Israel aid. Republican Senators Roger Marshall, Ted Cruz, J.D. Vance, and Mike Lee introduced a standalone bill to funnel aid to Israel without tying it to Ukraine aid on Thursday. The bill, called the Supplemental Appropriations Act, is an alternative to President Biden's $106 billion emergency supplemental bill he requested from Congress last week. That was the bill that we covered. Now, obviously, J.D. Vance is a supporter of financing Israel's military and its wars. I would say you probably can't survive in Republican politics without taking that view. Certainly, Trump has that view. Joe Biden has that view. Kamala Harris has that view. And I've made my views of that very, very clear. That's obviously a place where I vehemently disagree with J.D. Vance, to put it mildly. But given the alternatives that Trump had to choose from in the Republican Party, he could have obviously gone with some hardcore Trump follower like Matt Gaetz or Marjorie Taylor Greene or Carrie Lake. And I think there, from a political perspective, that would not have been wise, because that really would not have expanded the appeal of the Republican Party. J.D. Vance not only will, for obvious reasons, but also there is a genuine record of him defending the kind of anti-establishment populist politics that got Donald Trump elected in 2016. We'll see throughout the campaign exactly how he articulates that. He's obviously going to be constrained by what Trump supports. And then obviously, in a lot of ways, this vice presidential pick is even more important than usual, given that Trump's age makes it highly unlikely that he could go beyond 4 years. And beyond that, he would be term limited. But there's also a chance, given Trump's age, that he wouldn't make it through the 4 years. And symbolically, certainly, this is Trump taking this movement that more or less he has single-handedly brought into the mainstream. It was bubbling in Republican politics for a long time, but he was able to articulate it and sell it. And he's essentially naming his successor. That's the significance of J.D. Vance being so much younger, from that next or even 2 generations removed from Trump. And so I do think J.D. Vance's selection is more important than the usual vice presidential selection. And I think deconstructing his actual ideology as reflected in his actions and votes and bills, not just in his rhetoric, is more important than ever.
Here is a lot of people recognize that we need to do something with Iran, but not these weak little bombing runs. If you're going to punch the Iranians, you punch them hard.
A lot of people recognize that we need to do something with Iran, but not these weak little bombing runs. If you're going to punch the Iranians, you punch them hard, and that's what he did when he took out Soleimani.
So I have no idea why people, well, I do, because Israel just like wanted us to do Libya. Israel wanted us to do Iraq. Israel wanted us to do Syria. This is all about Israel. And that now Iran is about Israel. And so Trump did that for Israel, Soleimani, and now he has to defend it because he's the vice president. So Candace Owens says, like, is it possible for us to get one effing person in office who doesn't immediately speak about how we need to continue bombing the Middle East? We do not need to do anything with Iran. I'm with Candace Owens on this. I'm against J.D. Vance and Trump on this. Why? Trump, his whole thing when he ran in 2016 was to stop doing that. That's why people liked him. That's why people voted for him. Non-interventionist, get us out of the Middle East. There was big mistakes. Okay, so that was Glenn Greenwald's breakdown, Candace Owens' breakdown, my a little bit of mine, and so now we know a little bit more about J.D. Vance, and now you know why he's again a mixed bag. There's bright spots. It's not horrible. It's not 100% horrible like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Hey, I'll see you on tour in Las Vegas, Chicago, and Grand Rapids. In Chicago, it's stand-up and a live panel show. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets, and make sure you go to jimmydore.com.